again, if Putin expands the conflict, which I doubt because I think he's quite spread thin right now, but if he does expand the conflict, then we might replicate what we do with Ukrainians, which is as active a support as possible, including training Ukrainian forces on NATO soil, providing sophisticated weapon systems, but not having NATO forces on the Ukraine or Georgian or Moldovan soil.
There are growing fears that the conflict in Ukraine could escalate after 3 days of attacks in a contested area of neighbouring Moldova. NATO's stance has hardened in recent days, with the UK, Germany and France all agreeing to supply more military hardware. So could we see NATO being drawn more directly into the conflict? To discuss this, let's talk to Fabrice Pothier, who's a former NATO Director of Policy Planning and a founding director of Carnegie Europe. Good morning to you, Fabrice.
Good morning.
Great to have you with us. Let me ask you just first of all, I don't know if you were able to hear Lesia Vasylenko was talking to us about the fact that there are sirens going on, strikes on all parts of Ukraine, although the key onslaught seems to be across the east of the country. What's your assessment of what Russia is trying to achieve now?
Well, I think clearly Vladimir Putin is digging in the east and also to gain as much of a stronghold in those regions before the 9th of May parade on the Red Square. The attacks on the other population centers in the West, I think, are ways for him to kind of keep the pressure on Zelensky and keep the pressure on the population, even though clearly he has failed in his goal of occupying the whole of Ukraine. What has to be noted, however, is that, of course, the Russians are running out of stock in terms of precision-guided munitions, cruise missiles, and so on. They are starting to shift some of their stocks from the east to the western military district where the battle is. So it shows also that he's running out of options.
You mentioned there this Victory Day parade in Red Square on May the 9th, and we're hearing suggestions that President Putin may use this occasion to openly say that Russia is at war with Ukraine, something that's actually been banned until now within Russia. What difference would that make?
Well, I think the noise you hear from some analysts is more that he might openly say that Russia is at war with NATO. And he might attempt to, because he's failing in Ukraine, he might attempt to basically broaden the conflict and make it a conflict of Russia versus the West. And I think that's the real fear, and that to support that, he might even call for the mass mobilization of the Russian population. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it shows that there is a lot of pressure here mounting on the campaign that is not going well. And where he needs to, Vladimir Putin is not the kind of person to give up easily, but he needs to either succeed or he will have to find a way out that is not too humiliating.
So what do you make of these explosions that we saw in this Transnistria region of Moldova, an area which does have a lot of Russian speakers? Russia has denied it was behind those, and in fact there have been dozens of different conspiracy theories have been put forward. What do you make of those attacks?
Well, Russia has more than Russian speakers in Transnistria. Russia has more than 1,000 so-called Russian peacekeepers, who are in fact Russian troops, keeping that territory away from Moldova. I think this is a distraction which is very common in the kind of tactics that Vladimir Putin uses, which is his main focus is obviously Ukraine and the eastern Donbass, but he's opening another flank to distract our resources and our political focus on helping another country, because obviously Moldova needs our support. So I think it's hopefully it's not opening another serious front, but it's obviously trying to spread our effort so that we are not giving all our focus to Ukraine.
And just before we bring in what NATO should be doing a bit more, I mean, it's clear that there is Mariupol, there are Ukrainian forces still holding out there, but it's clear that what Russia wants to do is to try to seize that whole swathe of territory, the east of the country down to the south, perhaps linking up with Crimea so that it has that strategic grip, if you like, on the east and part of the south of the country.
Yeah, I think that's been the goal actually since 2014. It's just that he could not do it all the way to Odessa and basically to Transnistria then. However, that doesn't mean it's going to happen now. Sadly, what you see with Mariupol is a strategy akin to Stalin of emptying an entire city of its population in order to conquer the city. So it is kind of the war of destruction, this kind of grinder that basically flattens an entire city. However, they clearly tried to start building some pressure on Odessa a few weeks ago, and they failed quite dramatically, actually, with the sinking of their flagship Navy ship in the Black Sea. So I think it might be able to do a land bridge from eastern Donbass to Crimea, but all the way to Transnistria, that's a longer shot.
What about NATO's response? We've got the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson today saying he's more determined than ever to support Ukraine. We've had the British Foreign Secretary saying that Britain should be prepared to send warplanes. At the start of this war, there was a lot of rhetoric saying, NATO wasn't going to be drawn into this. But it does seem as though increasingly NATO countries are prepared to send more and more what could be termed offensive weapons, although, of course, this is Ukraine trying to defend its own territory.
Today, I'm much prouder of what NATO does and says than some weeks ago when it was very hush-hush and very reluctant to speak up. And I think that's really dramatically changed since the Heads of State Summit in Brussels almost a month ago. The type of weaponry that NATO countries are now providing is exactly the kind of thing Ukraine needs to not only hold its territory, but push back on the kind of heavy war of attrition that the Russians now are trying to engage in. And I think the distinction between offensive and defensive weapon system has always been quite semantic and very political, in fact, because like you said, what Ukraine needs are weapon systems to defend their territory and their population. Within that, whether something is offensive or defensive is, again, something for politicians or a semantic consideration. They need everything in order to prosecute that war. And I think the UK can be proud of what it does on that front.
Although the response, predictably, from the Russians has been pretty hostile. The Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, saying NATO is, in essence, engaged in a war with Russia through a proxy and is arming that proxy. I mean, should that be something that NATO is concerned about? Or is the risk of President Putin succeeding in Ukraine so great that we need to continue doing that?
For once, I agree with Foreign Minister Lavrov. I think this is now de facto indeed a war between Ukraine and Russia, where NATO is supporting one side to defend its territory and its population. Absolutely. Whether we should be concerned, I think what is more concerning is that until recently, I kept on hearing in some parts of the NATO, the alliance, the fear that what happens if Vladimir Putin fails. I think that has changed. Now there is less inhibition about what a failure might mean and more willingness to talk about prevailing and making actually Vladimir Putin really fail in Ukraine. So I think we have to obviously treat that seriously and not engage in blind escalation, but nor should we avoid the word escalation and avoid the notion of managing escalation and putting the burden on Vladimir Putin and not letting him control escalation at will and threaten us and the Ukrainians.
Yeah, we've had the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying we want to see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do the kind of things that it's done in invading Ukraine. I mean, that seems to suggest that the US would like to completely, at least degrade Russia's war-fighting capabilities, which goes quite some way beyond helping Ukraine defend itself.
Absolutely, but I think that's the natural conclusion of 8 years of failed containment strategy since the first Russian war of aggression against Ukraine in 2014, where the notion was we're going to do economic sanctions, we will have some sort of diplomatic engagement with Russia to try to bring them back to some kind of resolution of the conflict. And clearly that failed because Vladimir Putin decided to launch an even uglier and deadlier war against Ukraine. So I think now the next stage is really to degrade them indeed economically, industrially, and militarily so that they do not contemplate another war of aggression of that kind.
What about President Putin's threats, not so thinly veiled even, of using tactical nuclear weapons? I mean, do you think that threat is realistic? And I mean, is there a danger that the sort of language that we're hearing from the West as well as from the Russians could make that more likely?
I think nothing that is pertaining to nuclear weapons should be taken lightly, including coming from the mouth of Vladimir Putin, because often what he says, he does. However, that doesn't mean we should ignore and stay muted. And on the contrary, when it comes to nuclear weapons, what is very important is to have a very clear collective message that these weapons and weapons of mass destruction have no place whatsoever in that conflict. And the moment they will be brought in, and that's where tactical or strategic nuclear weapon, that distinction is irrelevant, the moment WMDs are brought in, it will fundamentally change the nature of the conflict. And I think that's a very clear warning that we need to address to Vladimir Putin, which was kind of missing at the beginning of the war when he started to do nuclear blackmail, and which we slightly corrected, but I will hope that we'll be much clearer about the cost and consequences of bringing WMD. And just to finish, this is not just about Vladimir Putin engaging in nuclear blackmail. This is also China looking very closely at our response to this kind of WMD blackmail, and to see what kind of lesson it can draw for its own region and its own aggressive intention.
So do you think it was a mistake early on in the war when, for example, President Biden made it very clear saying NATO's not going to be drawn directly into this conflict? We're not hearing that anymore, are we?
No, I think we still hear that we're not going to do direct combat operation. But what you hear less is that, this is more NATO allies doing kind of direct support to the Ukrainian. Now NATO collectively has a much clearer stance and much more active support. But what was missing, I think, was on this nuclear question. We've lost in a way a lot of our nuclear deterrence grammar over the past few decades because we've been living in a kind of time of peace where you don't want to think about nuclear weapons every day. But the problem is Vladimir Putin brought back that question, and we need to have a clear, control answer, because if we don't answer that back, he might be willing to use them because he's not fully aware of the consequences.
So should, given what is happening and what we're seeing on the ground, the evidence of potential war crimes, the continuing assaults along the east, this bombardment of Mariupol, should NATO now be sending more troops? I know NATO forces have been sent to increase the presence on the ground in some of those frontline states, the Baltic states, Poland and so on. But should we be sending more NATO troops to places like Moldova and Georgia, which are not actually members of NATO, but would clearly appreciate a bit more military support?
I think we will try to stay right below the threshold of direct military presence in those countries for obvious reasons. First, they are not under direct attack yet, hopefully. And second, I think NATO sends troops to first the NATO territory. And what you are saying is it's almost a given now we are going to actually make the NATO troops presence on the eastern flank a more permanent presence. As until now, it was more rotational presence. So this is almost a given. Now, what we do with Georgia and Moldova, again, if Putin expands the conflict, which I doubt because I think he's quite spread thin right now, but if he does expand the conflict, then we might replicate what we do with Ukrainians, which is as active a support as possible, including training Ukrainian forces on NATO soil, providing sophisticated weapon systems, but not having NATO forces on the Ukraine or Georgian or Moldovan soil.
Fabrice Pothier, former NATO Director of Policy Planning and founding director of the Carnegie Europe Organisation. Great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.